Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our first Idaho State Council of SHRM webinar. While we're waiting to start, people are still coming in, we're going to have a poll that I would love to have everyone answer. We have people from all over the state of Idaho and some from outside of the state, and we're just curious to where you're joining us from. So please answer the poll. Once we get our results in, then we will share those results with everyone. Okay, no surprise there, Treasure Valley with 57%. Southeast Idaho coming in strong with 22, Snake River 13, and then our Northern Idaho folks with 7%. And then looks like we have a few people outside of the state of Idaho. So that is awesome. Well, welcome again. My name is Stephanie Cecil. In my volunteer role, I am the director of the Idaho State Council of SHRM. SHRM stands for the Society for Human Resource Management. My position that pays the bills, though, is as the HR director for Frontier Credit Union, located in Idaho Falls, Idaho. The Idaho State Council of SHRM provides professional leadership and resources that promotes, supports, and advances the HR profession by partnering with SHRM, affiliate chapters, SHRM members, and Idaho communities. For those that were in the waiting room, you may have seen the slides for our chapters. Idaho has 3 amazing chapters. The HR Association of the Treasure Valley, also known as HRATV, Snake River chapter located in Twin Falls, Southeast Idaho chapter in Idaho Falls. If you're located in these areas and haven't checked out your local chapter, I encourage you to do so. They provide professional development content, such as monthly learning opportunities and conferences. We also have 2 student chapters, one located at Boise State and one at University of Idaho. The Idaho State Council hosts an employment law conference every other year in Boise, with our next one scheduled for September 19th, 2025. We also hope to provide more webinars in the future. Okay, so that's enough chit chat from me. I am excited to introduce the person that set this webinar in motion, our Workforce Development Chair for the Idaho State Council, Stephanie Parker. Stephanie is the founder of Boise-based Talent Spark, a woman-owned recruiting firm, and she's going to introduce our speaker. Stephanie, it's all yours.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I also wanted to extend a warm welcome to all of our members who are on this call today. A special welcome to our national SHRM members, their guests, and of course, members of our local SHRM chapters in Southeast Idaho, Snake River area, and also the Treasure Valley. My name is Stephanie Parker, and I am fortunate to serve as the Workforce Development Director, both at the Idaho State Council level as well as at the local level for HRATV. I am very, very excited to introduce our speaker, Sam Wolkenhaur, but before I do, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. First, Sam will present for about 45 minutes, and we will be sure to reserve about 5 to 10 minutes of time at the end of the presentation for Q&A. Please be sure that you use the chat feature to put your questions in as you think of them. You do not need to save up your questions for the end. Please put them into chat as you think of them, and then at the end of Sam's presentation, we will do a roundup of your questions so Sam can address those. I also wanted to let you know that this presentation will be recorded and slides will be accessible after today's webinar. And then lastly, we will be providing SHRM continuing education credit for attending today's meeting. That will be provided at the very end of the session. So you'll need to wait around till the very last slide to receive that information. And now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Sam Wolkenhaur, who is a labor economist for the Idaho Department of Labor. Sam provides economic insight and analysis for the state of Idaho, including projections of the state's labor market and demographics. Sam is an in-demand speaker. If you have seen Sam speak, you know that this is a real treat on the topic of Idaho workforce trends, and has been widely recognized for his engaging speaking style and bringing a humorous and clear approach to the data. So with that, I am very honored to turn the mic over to Sam, and please join me in welcoming him today.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I am going to be sharing a lovely PowerPoint slide with you. I know this is everybody's favorite part of the day is when a PowerPoint presentation of unknown length comes on your screen and you wonder how long you are trapped with this thing. So what I'm going to try to do for you today is give you a sort of holistic look at what's going on with the economy. We want to talk about inflation and prices, obviously. We also want to talk about labor and the hiring difficulties that we know exist across the state, not just in Idaho, but really across the whole country. It's a very tight hiring environment right now. So we want to try to understand what's going on. And before we get into kind of the meat of the presentation, we just want to acknowledge that we're living through a very muddled economic time. It can be very difficult to parse out what's actually happening. And I want to give you a demonstration of that by kind of remembering what has happened over the last year. So if we remember where we were at essentially in Q1 of 2023, so a year ago, right? What was going on in the economy? You might remember a little institution called Silicon Valley Bank, which had the dubious honor of being the first, major American bank to have a failure, legitimate bank failure, a bank run on its deposits. And this was terrifying because banks haven't really failed in any meaningful way in the United States in over a decade. And so you had a lot of people worried that these regional bank failures were kind of a leading signal that the financial system was in some sort of breakdown, right? Then you had one of the most important financial institutions in the world, JP Morgan. And we certainly would have to admit that JP Morgan implies a robust staff of highly credentialed and competent economists. And they made the disturbing note here that in their staff forecast, they were now expecting a recession in the year 2023. And they even used this language saying that the economy was probably past the point of no return, headed for a recession. Okay, so that's not good. And it was apparently destined to get worse because right around that time, we started to see a bunch of layoffs from tech companies, right? And so first off, we learned that we don't know what any of these companies are actually called, right? Because Google is actually Alphabet and Twitter is actually X, Facebook is actually Meta. So we learned that none of these companies have the name we thought they did. Maybe that's just me because I'm not actually on social media, but that was a revelation for me. And they were all laying people off. A lot of these companies were laying off something on the order of 20% or more of their workforce. Okay, and so that's a little terrifying because these are some of the largest, highest performing companies in the country. And so when you have sector-wide layoffs, banks going belly up, and a bank like JP Morgan saying, yeah, we think there's going to be a recession this year, this is painting a very dark picture on the whole. And then finally, the Federal Reserve, our central bank, without any exaggeration or controversy, the most important financial institution in the world. And their staff economists also expected a recession at some point in 2023. And so they said that the banking crisis and sort of inflation and all these other things going on probably going to tilt the US into a recession. Okay, so this is a very dour picture of the economy that we got a year ago. Well, what happened subsequently? If you look at the actual indicators of the economy, it actually looks pretty much okay. Okay, so the blue line, that's GDP, right? That's economic output. You can see the big drop from COVID in 2020, but then this is just kind of chugging along up to the top right corner. Same with jobs. That's the black line on the other side. Big drop from the pandemic. We understand that COVID was a major hit to the economy, but then just kind of climbing out of that hole, chugging away, rolling up towards the top right. And then we look at Idaho in particular, and this looks pretty fantastic. Okay, this is Idaho's job creation. So this is just total non-farm employment in the state. Again, you get the hit from COVID, but Idaho's been growing so consistently that we not only met, but even exceeded many of our forecasts that were made before COVID, right? So you would think, you remember back to April of 2020 when the pandemic was really wreaking havoc on the economy. would have been fair to think, well, we're probably not going to meet our growth targets. We did. We actually surpassed them. And so Idaho's labor market is essentially just a line right up to the top right corner. And frankly, if I were to just redact those 6 months from the middle of 2020, just kind of erase them from the graph, you would never know that we'd even had a pandemic or a recession. This is just this inexorable climb up to the top right corner. And that's important because what they teach you in an economics program is that kind of all good things in life are in the top right-hand corner of graphs, okay? So we're going up in the right direction, and this creates a little bit of confusion, right? Because bank failures, tech layoffs, very negative outlook from major financial institutions. But then you look at job creation and GDP and you think, this looks like a pretty healthy economy, right? So what's actually the story here? And lo and behold, all of those fears kind of faded away. So the Fed conducted a stress test of the banking sector and concluded, there were a few banks that really had a bad looking balance sheet. But apart from a few unhealthy banks, the majority of the banking sector, pretty healthy. JP Morgan said they were just kidding, right? They decided no recession, actually the economy is going to grow, right? So, maybe this is a little bit exaggerative, but they used language like past the point of no return that really implies some sort of confidence in the idea that we were going to have a recession. And then they say, actually, it's the opposite. The economy is going to grow. Tech layoffs didn't really damage the economy. All those laid off workers found jobs in other sectors very quickly. So even with major tech companies conducting large-scale layoffs, you didn't have a spike in unemployment. You didn't have any real economic damage from that. And then finally, the Federal Reserve was punking us as well. And so they also dropped the recession from their forecast, right? So with this kind of whiplash going on, it's fair to ask, do we actually know what's happening with the economy? Are we making this up as we go? Is there any kind of solid analysis under the covers here that we can find? And so that's what I want to give you is a little bit more of a clear understanding of why there's this kind of analytic whiplash and what's happening with the economy, because actually we can understand it pretty well. So we're going to talk about inflation. We're going to talk about the labor market. We're going to talk about demographics, and hopefully you come away with a solid understanding of what the economy's been through and where it appears to be going. Okay, so let's start off by talking about inflation. Inflation, obviously a major topic with large run-up in prices stressing households. So we want to understand what's happened with inflation and why have we had this problem. Okay, this is our sort of headline look at inflation. This is the year-over-year growth in the consumer price index. Okay, and you can see a big run-up 21 through 22 before it begins to ease and gradually come back down. Now, there's two things that we want to say about this. Number one, inflation compounds, right? So when you have a year of 5% inflation, and then a year of 8% inflation, and then another year of 6% inflation, that compounds on itself like interest does. So even though you would look at this and go, oh, inflation got up to 7% year over year, we're talking about 3+ years of inflation, which means by this point, consumer prices are up more than 30% in a lot of categories, right? Because this really builds on itself across the years. Now, the rate of inflation has come down. It's currently sitting right around 3%. The most recent number that we had was 3.1. Okay, so we've made a lot of progress bringing this down. But what we have to admit about this is, let's just be honest. Most Americans are not particularly wedded to the precise number that comes out of the CPI every month. What do people actually want? Well, what they want is pretty simple. They want their old prices back, right? So when we point at this and go, oh, we're cooling down to 3% year over year, so you should stop complaining, that's really kind of tone deaf. It's being needlessly obtuse about what has happened to prices and the stress that that has put on American households. So essentially, if you are friends with a Fed economist, which might be difficult, I would assume they're somewhat esoteric and difficult to penetrate people. They live in a cognitively sophisticated world. But let's say you were friends with an economist at the Fed, and you went to a gas station, and you would say, look at these prices, look at what inflation has done. And he would say, well, it only went up 3 cents last month. So what are you complaining about? You're looking at the big picture of, why is gasoline $5 a gallon? When is it going to go back to sub 3? Wouldn't that be nice? He's more concerned with how fast is it growing, right? And so there's a disconnect when we look at metrics like this versus what everyday Americans care about, and rightfully so. They would like prices to go back to where they were. So we end up with a little bit of a difficult situation where people have been stressed in a significant way by the increase in prices. And that concern, that need is really not addressed by focusing on inflation metrics like this. Okay, so we have to understand there's a disconnect in the discourse as to how inflation's talked about. Okay, the other thing that we want to talk about on the subject of inflation is we obviously want to know why this happened. Okay, we can look at the timing, and it's pretty obvious that this ensued following the pandemic. Okay, and so then the question becomes, to what extent was it the pandemic causing this? Was it stimulus checks, et cetera, et cetera? We want to parse out this story. And the answer doesn't really satisfy anybody because most people prefer a simple monocausal explanation for things. But the reality is that inflation was caused by a concatenation of two things. It was the pandemic disrupting supply chains simultaneous with major stimulatory packages. So let me explain what that means. Okay, number one, the pandemic created havoc in supply chains. Well, what does that mean? Okay. People think that when we talk about supply chains, essentially what we mean is, you got to pay more for shipping. Shipping companies have to, burn more fuel. There's longer wait times, and so prices go up. Okay, that's part of it. The major reason, though, that the pandemic caused inflation through supply chains is the pandemic created shortages. Okay, and it created shortages because the global economy contracted very rapidly, with major industrial economies essentially turning themselves off, and that creates shortages of products. Okay, so this is an index that shows you the price of raw materials, what's happened to raw material prices. And you can see that starting in mid-2020, they began to explode. And within about 18 months, raw material prices had gone up over 50%. Okay, and so that increase in the price of raw materials gets passed on to consumers because you have shortages, it drives up prices. So let me explain how this works a little more. A great example is what you have going on in the Red Sea right now, okay? The Al-Ansar movements, which we commonly call the Houthis, are shooting ballistic missiles at ships, and stopping that is proving difficult. So what does that mean for you, right? Because the Red Sea is pretty far away. What does that actually mean? Well, when you can go through the Red Sea, you go up through the Suez Canal around the Mediterranean, it takes you about 33 days to drive a container ship, a cargo ship, from Shanghai to Rotterdam. And that's a trip that we like to use as an example because that's basically China's biggest port going to Europe's biggest port, right? So that's a major voyage, 33 days. Okay. Let's say you can't go through the Red Sea because there's missiles flying around and you have to go all the way around Africa. Well, that trip is about 57 days, okay? And that added time means that you can't move as much cargo because you're spending more time in transit, right? And keep in mind, something like a quarter of all the global trade goes through the Red Sea. So there have been estimates that if the Red Sea was totally closed to shipping, it would reduce the transportation capacity of the global shipping system by about 8%. So think about that. Think about the global economy trying to function with 8% less stuff being able to move around. 8% less fertilizer, less grain, less petroleum, less consumer products, aluminum, on and on and on it goes. That's where the inflation comes from. It's not just you have to burn more fuel on a longer trip, and so that's more expensive. It's literally shortages that come from the fact that you cannot move cargo in the same quantity that you need to. Right? That is the root of inflation, is shortages caused by the contraction of shipping. And that was a major issue with the pandemic, but it's still an issue when you have things going on like kinetic action in the Red Sea. So you have shortages, drives up prices, but then the other element of this, the other ingredient is the stimulus. And what the stimulus essentially did, and first let me clarify, when we say stimulus, we're not just talking about direct deposit checks. There was a wide range of stimulus undertaken during the pandemic. The stimulus checks were one of those, of course, but you also had student loan payments being deferred, rents being deferred, you had unemployment insurance expanding, you had a lot of different measures to try to keep cash in the economy. And what that did essentially was give the American consumer an extra $5 to $6 trillion in cash that they were sitting on. Well, why is that important? Well, 2021 comes around. We're kind of moving out of the pandemic, but prices are starting to rise. Well, ordinarily, when prices go up, you expect the consumer to spend less, right? That's a natural reaction. Things are more expensive. I need to be more careful with my spending. I need to save more, kind of be a little more wary about my spending habits. Well, when there's $6 trillion extra dollars sloshing around, that impulse is significantly lessened. And so this time around, instead of saving more, consumers spent very aggressively, even with the rising prices. So I'll show you what that looks like. This is American consumption, right? So this is essentially consumer spending. And it's showing you how much it grows on a year-over-year basis. Look at how much more the consumer was spending in 2022, for example. So you have sort of a perfect storm here. You have issues with shipping and raw materials and shortages, and that's driving prices up. But then you have a consumer that, thanks to all that extra cash, they really don't care. Okay? So the way we would put this is, for the first year or two, the American consumer was largely blind to the effects of inflation. And so it's rather unusual because if you ask people in surveys, right, are you worried about inflation? Do you think prices are rising, going to continue to rise? They will say things very pessimistic, right? Like, yes, inflation is a major problem. Prices are rising. They're correct. But then when you look at their actual actions, they're spending a lot of money, right? So there's this disconnect where we were resistant to the normal impulse to save, to go into sort of a financial bunker mode, try to hunker down and save. We ignored that, kept spending, and that put fuel on inflation and caused it to last longer than it would have otherwise. Okay, so this is your basic picture of inflation. Problems with raw materials and shipping create shortages. That's why, for the first time in a long time, 2021, you could go down to a dealership financially prepared to purchase a vehicle. It's literally not there, right? Shortages of products drive the prices up. And then thanks to all that stimulus sloshing around in the economy, the consumer really ignored that and continued to spend. And this is our basic picture of inflation and why it's still lingering, 4 years on into this cycle. Okay, so let's talk about labor, because labor availability is very closely linked to this, because it's the availability of labor that allows you to fix shortages. You need to make more stuff. You need to get the system juicing again properly. You need workers who can actually produce things. So let's talk about what's going on with labor. And the reality is we have an overheated labor market in the United States. So we have a pretty simple comparison that we want to make. How many people are available to work, and how many open jobs are there that we're trying to fill with those people? And what you find is, so we're just looking at the comparison of these two lines. Blue is the number of open jobs, black is the number of unemployed people. You can obviously see the pandemic, big spike in the number of unemployed, but look at where we're at now. The disconnect has gone the other way. There's actually significantly more open jobs than there are unemployed people, such that there are essentially millions of jobs that cannot be filled. And the reason we can't fill those jobs is very fundamental. It's at the base level. We have a shortage of the key input in the economy. What is the most important economic input? It's human capital. Even more fundamentally, it is what we would maybe call warm Homo sapiens, right? Human beings, and there are not enough of them to fill the number of open jobs. So you end up with millions of positions that cannot be filled. And we obviously want to ask why this is, okay? So let's talk about where this labor shortage came from. What's wrong with the labor supply? And there are a few things that will traditionally get pointed to. Okay, skill level mismatch is a nice sort of techno-bureaucratic way of saying, we need training programs, and certainly more training, more education is always beneficial for the workforce. We also need to recognize there is a strata of the population that really cannot hold a job successfully due to issues with mental illness, substance abuse, etc. Right? So that's a problem as well. We also have issues with teen work rates, and it's convenient and almost stereotypical to just blame teenagers for everything. I guess that's that's sort of traditional. Teens have always been sort of an easy scapegoat demographic. But what we need to acknowledge here is that statistically, teen work rates right now are at historic lows. Okay, Gen Z appears so far to have the worst work habits of any generation that we've ever measured. Okay, and that's not just a kids these days rant. That is baked into the data that teen work rates have been in a pretty catastrophic decline. Okay, now the issue here though is teen work rates, not having teens in the workforce, this will obviously impact certain industries, hotels, golf courses, restaurants, retail, etc. But we also have shortages of people like trauma surgeons and programmers and engineers, occupations that I would say historically are not filled by 16-year-olds, right? So we can't blame the teens for the full spectrum of the labor shortage. Certainly they hurt some service sector industries pretty hard with these low work rates, but they're not to blame for the whole thing, right? It's not the 16-year-olds' fault that we don't have enough nurses, for example. Then you get disabilities and substance abuse. Already kind of alluded to that, keeps people from being able to live productive lives. Childcare availability is another big problem. And then finally, you have gig work, informal employment. So this would refer not just to things like driving for Uber, but also the increase in, freelance working, piecework, etc. Okay, so this is kind of the little laundry list of things that you will hear thrown out as reasons why we have a labor shortage, why we don't have enough workers. But what I want to suggest to you is that actually these things tend to be pretty marginal against the bigger problem. And the bigger problem is the demographics of the country. So that's what we want to understand. And let me illustrate this for you. This is a metric that we call the labor force participation rate. It's a long name, LFPR, we usually call it, because we love a good acronym that you can't voice. It just ends up being a jumble of letters. So this is one of our favorite letter jumbles. What does it mean? It simply means what percentage of the adult population is working or in the labor force, right? So it's kind of like a measure of the overall productive ratio of your adult population, okay? And let's look at it here. This is from 2020 onwards. So this is kind of the pandemic and beyond story. You do get a big drop from the pandemic, drops by almost 3 full percentage points. But then it starts to recover, right? It's kind of on an upward trend back up to where it started. So if we're looking for short-term problems, right, a pandemic era effect, we're looking at this and we're going, well, the labor rate actually looks like it's in a state of recovery. It looks okay. But the problem is we're looking at a very narrow time frame here. So this graph starts at 2020. I want to show you the same graph, but starting many decades prior. It looks like this, right? So COVID and beyond is just that little black square there, just the last couple of years. Turns out work rates have been in a state of long-term decline, really going back to the late 1990s. Okay, so this would suggest to me that looking at the pandemic as the cause of this is deeply misguided. Okay, so labor rates have been in a long-term state of decline, and you might be looking at this axis going, wait, it's only down by 5 or 6 percentage points. So is that really that significant? We're talking about from 67 to 62%, something like that. How much does that really matter? Remember, we're talking about 5 percentage points of an adult population of 200 million people. right? So you end up with 10 million plus workers missing from the labor force. That's how many people we're missing based on the decline of work rates here. So it actually is very significant when you think about it in those terms, even though the percentage points themselves don't seem significant. So we don't want to be looking at this little black box here at the end. We want to be thinking about this. Why is there this long-term systemic decline in work rates? And it turns out the answer primarily is due to the aging of the country. Okay, so this is what we want to understand. This is what I want to kind of walk you through here. So we have to look now at a metric that is the single most important metric in social sciences, economics, history. Okay, and it is the birth rate. Okay, and so what I'm going to show you is that actually when we talk about the decline in the labor rate, it's almost exclusively due to two things. Okay, it's due to an increase in retirements, and it's due to having more people in school that are less likely to work while they're in school. Okay, so this pie chart, this is where'd all the workers go? Like, what happened to them? Where have they vanished to? And it turns out well over half of it is retirements. And then the second biggest chunk, that green chunk, is just the fact that college students, high school students are less likely to be working today than they used to. And together, these things account for 85% of the decline in the labor force. So what's causing this? And at its heart, this is a manifestation of the birth rate, okay? The birth rate, it's also called the fertility rate. It's essentially a metric for family size, right? Average number of children per family. And you need 2.1 children per family for your population to be stable. And the reason you need 2.1, you need that extra 0.1, right, to account for adolescent males and their risk-seeking behavior, because they do things like jump off of tall objects, they go crabbing in the Bering Sea, and so you need some extra. So you need 2.1 children per family, and if that's the average family size, your population will stay stable in the long run, okay? But what I want you to observe is we're pretty much below that constantly, right? So pretty much 50 out of the last 60 years, we've been below the replacement rate in terms of family size. And what that means is you're accumulating, kind of think of it as a demographic deficit or a shortage of people that you will eventually feel. And I know that the fertility rate can be uncomfortable to talk about, obviously, because on an individual basis, this is the intimate decision of the mother, right? But on a societal basis, as you expand this to, national scale, this determines what happens to your country. And to illustrate that, I like to talk about South Korea, because South Korea has the lowest birth rate in the world. It's actually 0.7. So they have on average, fewer than one child per family. And the reason it's so interesting is South Korea is a phenomenally well-developed, wealthy, educated, healthy society, right? All things considered, if you're spinning a wheel, South Korea is a pretty good country to be born into. It's a very prosperous, very highly educated society, but their birth rate is shockingly low at 0.7. Well, what does that mean? That means with every generation that's born, the size falls by more than half. So if you think about it, if your birth rate is the same as South Korea's and you maintain that over several generations, after 4 generations, your country's population will be only 5% of what it was when you started, because it's more than halving with every subsequent generation. And this is not to pass judgment on South Korea. It's just to illustrate the mathematic property we're talking about, that this determines what happens to your population in the long run, okay? And so when your fertility rate, when your family size looks like this, you're setting up a problem for yourself. Now, before I click to the next slide, I just want you to look at one thing. Look at how high this was in 1960. It was at almost 4 children per family. This is why the baby boomers are the biggest generation ever. They were the last generation to be born in the era of very high family sizes. Okay, and when that's the demographic profile, you end up with a very, very big generation. Those are our baby boomers. So let's look at what this does to your demographics. Our demographics look like this. You have male and female on opposite sides. And I had someone ask me, why you laid out like this with the two male and female, separated. And it's actually very important because in many countries there are imbalances due to things like war. So for example, if you were to look at Germany's profile after World War II, there's huge chunks missing from the male portion. We're fortunate that we live in a country that's been largely spared such catastrophes. So ours is pretty balanced, right? But there are countries where you will see a huge difference from side to side due to things like war and famine, etc. So the way we read this is each bar is the size of a population that's 5 years in age. So to make that more concrete, if you look at the bottom leftmost bar, bottom left, you see we essentially have 10 million little girls in this country between 0 and 5 years old, right? So my 2-year-old daughter goes in that bar, right? And then I am up in the, I should lie and say the late 20s bar, but it's actually the early 30s bar on the male side, right? So this is kind of just how we see the shape of the population. And you can see a few things here. I probably could get away with saying I'm in the 20s bar. I kind of have youthful features and they've never served me well, but maybe it's time to start playing that. So what we're going to do though is look for bulges. Where are big populations? And one of the obvious bulges is this one up here. You see a big hump in the late 50s, early 60s. So this is your baby boomers, right? There's 71 million baby boomers. So at the time they were born, biggest generation ever. Sadly, the oldest baby boomers are now in their late 70s, so we're starting to see population decline among the boomers. At their peak, there were closer to 80 million, but there's still a lot of them, okay? And these are obviously very important people because there were so many of them. They really powered America's economy, determined cultural taste, etc., for a long time. Below the baby boomers, we have Gen X. Gen X slotted right in here. They fly under the radar for two reasons. Number one, they are smaller. Look, there's only 66 million of them. So they're still outnumbered by 5 million. And at one point it was, more than 10 million, how badly they were outnumbered. The other reason people never talk about Gen X is look at where they are in life. They're going to work, paying their taxes, being productive. They're really not rocking the boat. This is a very unproblematic generation. They're just going to work, low criminality, great social behaviors. But if you're not doing anything naughty, if you're not destabilizing the structure here, you really fly under the radar. So Gen X, kind of a classic middle child generation, they don't get a lot of attention because they're just doing exactly what they're supposed to do, and simply because there are not so many of them. Below Gen X, we have millennials. So this is the other bulge. Okay, you can see how it flares out. So this is an oversized generation. Now, why are there so many millennials? Well, the reason millennials are a big generation is because the baby boomers are our parents. Okay, and when you have a lot of baby boomers, you end up with a good number of millennials too. Okay, and I'm going to show you the millennials actually ended up being a very, very important generation in terms of the fact that they've really stabilized the economy for the last decade. And I'm going to show you, though, now where our problem is. This is our problem, Gen Z. And this is not necessarily a comment on the innate personal qualities of Gen Z, but look at the numbers. Only 67 million. They're significantly smaller than the millennials. But the other thing I want to point out about Gen Z is look at the way the bars stack up. Each bar is a little smaller than the one before it, right? So for example, there's more 15 to 20-year-olds than there are 10 to 15-year-olds, right? So most of Gen Z is in the top. It's in the older ages of this generation. So not only are they small, but they're front-loaded is another way of thinking about this. So let's think about this on a mass scale, okay? We have a generation of 71 million, used to be more baby boomers that's retiring. And who do we have to replace them? Well, we've only got 67 million of Gen Z. So even if the work habits were equivalent, we would be short millions of people on this exchange, right? The handoff between generations, where a large retirement generation coincides with a small youth generation, leaves you short millions and millions of people. But it's even worse because remember what I told you, Gen Z actually has some of the worst work habits. They have the lowest labor force participation rates at their age, any generation we've ever had. So fundamentally, one of the biggest stressors on the country right now is this simple fact. A very large generation with exceptional work habits, just statistically measured, is retiring, and it's being replaced by a small generation with less superb work habits. Okay, that trade-off is the root of our problem. Okay, and you can see how there's really nothing you can do about this, right? Because demographics move very, very slowly. I like to compare demographics essentially to skiing down a glacier, right? If you are skiing down a glacier, what you're trying to do is not hit things. You don't want to hit rocks and trees, go off a cliff. And obviously that's rational. That's like the correct thing you should be focused on. But you're not noticing that the glacier's moving under your feet because it moves really slow, right? Moves at a couple inches a year. Similarly, we actually age kind of slowly. We don't necessarily always feel that way, but we age at a constant rate of 1 year per year, and we all age at the same rate. And so demographics move slowly. It can take 40 plus years for you to feel these imbalances really impacting society. But like that glacier, 50 years from now, what is it that's carved the landscape out, right? It's not the rocks and the trees, the short-term obstacles that you were worried about. It was the ground that was moving under your feet. You know, a glacier will literally carve the side off of a mountain, build a valley out of nothing. It's very, very powerful, but it moves so slowly that we're not really focused on it all the time, okay? And that's exactly how demographics function. And so just to illustrate this, I want to show you what's happened to American labor force, okay? This is America's labor force growth post-pandemic. So this is just the total availability of workers. Drop off from the pandemic, slow recovery. So let's look at where we are in the top right there. Okay, the labor force has grown by 2% since COVID. That's really slow, okay? 2 percentage points over, at this point, going on 5 years is anemic growth. The labor force used to grow by 2 to 3% per year. Now we're looking at just this very baseline level of growth over this 5-year period. But let me show you what happens when I take out the foreign-born population. If you look at the non-foreign-born, so domestic population, what happens to the labor force? Zero growth, okay? So without foreign immigration, the United States labor force would not have grown at all over the last 5 years. And this is not to make a judgment on this immigration policy being good or bad. This is simply the mathematical point that the American workforce no longer grows under its own power. That's kind of the takeaway that we want to have here, is that in a vacuum, America is now a zero growth labor force. And that's almost exclusively dictated by the demographics. Because fundamentally, when you have more people turn 65 than turn 18, you cannot grow your labor force. That's the foundational element here, and that's the problem that we have. So just to put the long-term view on this, and then we'll wrap up and take some questions. This is the story of America's economy, okay? It's a pretty simple graph. What percentage of the population is between 15 and 64 years old? So essentially, how much of your population is working age, okay? Oh, look at those boomers go. There's so many of them. They're a very hardworking generation. They really drove up productivity. So the economy fundamentally becomes more productive. It has a higher productive potential with all those young baby boomers. Then remember what I told you, Gen X, great generation, just not as many of them as we would love to have. So we kind of stagnate for a little bit with Gen X. Millennials, another big generation. And this is why I say millennials turned out to be a very important population, because the size of the millennials backstopped the labor force for a decade. And the way I like people to think about this is the decade from 2010 to 2020 was a Goldilocks zone. And what I mean by that is, for a brief period of time, so in the long run, a decade is not that long, but For that decade, both of the big generations were working simultaneously. The boomers had not yet retired, the millennials were coming into the workforce, and while we could double dip on the big groups, we had plenty of workers, right? So it's not a coincidence. The economy was great throughout most of the 2010s, solid growth. Okay. Then you run out of millennials and you have to dip into Gen Z. And the reality is, even ignoring the issue of work habits and their unique cultural and media tastes, which is an enormous topic all of its own, there's just not enough of them. And you end up short millions of people. And so this begins to slide. And the problem is, given what's going on with family size, this is unlikely to correct itself. So the blue dot is where we're at right now. And then that blue line is kind of our forecast for the rest of the century. And so fundamentally, the American economy, American institutions, American hospitals, they can't function the same way at 60% working age as they did when it was 70% working age. The productive potential of the economy seems to be slipping due to this demographic shift. And so understanding that this is at the heart of most of the issues we face is very, very important, because the last thing I want you to be doing is trying to just wait this out, right? We have to understand that structurally we're in a tight labor environment, and we're not going to wait it out because it's not a cyclical issue, right? You're not going to just wait out the business cycle and have this repair itself in the long run, because we're actually still close to the top and we're looking straight down the nose of a long slide in demographics. So with that, I believe we will transition to questions. There's like a summary slide here, just because people kind of expect a little, bullet point recap. So I'll leave that up. You can read that if you want, but I think that for now, we will transition to a Q&A.
Sam, can you hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Okay, so our first question is from Melissa Aston, and she asked, what is the definition of unemployment or unemployed? Is it just people searching for a job?
So to be considered unemployed, you need to be available and looking for work. And people sometimes get confused because we also have unemployment insurance. But being unemployed it's not confined just to people claiming unemployment benefits. There's a lot of people who are unemployed even though they're not claiming benefits. And it just means available to work, essentially.
Thanks, Sam. Next question is from Brenda Blitman, and she asked, during the recession in 2008 to 2012, teams had a hard time finding work. Has there been a long-term impact from that situation?
It seems that the recession did have a phenomenon on that, or it had an effect on that, and it created this sort of prejudice is a strong word, but a sort of bias against work for teens. And then that seems to have been exacerbated again during COVID, because people become habituated to not working, right? And so being, not having a job has become more normalized among children, not children, but teenagers than it used to be. The other issue is that there seems to be more of a bias towards focusing on your studies, on academics. So we've seen a big drop in like the percentage of college students that have a job. They prefer to be more narrowly focused on their academics and less likely to work.
Awesome, thank you. Phoebe Ingram asked, what impact, if any, are you seeing on the labor market as it pertains to an increase in AI-related tools, equipment, etc.?
So what we have to say about this is simply that it's very strange, because obviously technology has grown in amazing ways in the last decade, right? And we feel this all the time in our everyday life. And yet we have not seen labor productivity explode the way you would expect given technological changes. So it seems to us that we're still waiting for AI, automation, and technology to really have that impact felt. because we can see the technological changes, but so far it doesn't seem to be having a major impact on the labor market. And it's possible that it's only a matter of time, but we haven't been able to measure that yet.
Some comments about the alpha generation. Do you have any feedback on the impact they're going to have?
So it's too early to say what their work habits will be because they're still, they're essentially all under the age of 10. And what I will note is that there seems to be a phenomenon with, they're calling them Gen Alpha. There seems to be what I would call a bifurcation in this generation, where you have some children that have more technological exposure than any generation ever. They're essentially saturated with technology. And then you have another section of this generation that has very little to no technological interface. And it comes down to this split in parenting philosophies, right? Technology, intimate experience with technology seems to be the key to the future, but it also seems to have some negative impacts on children's brains and social development. So the question is, do you overexpose children to tech so that they're very familiar with this, very well suited perhaps for the future skills demanded in the labor market, or do you hold them back from technology out of concerns for their cognitive development? So you almost end up with two simultaneous generations. You have a hyper-tech and a no-tech generation coexisting. And it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out.
I think so too. Diana Carrillo said the Bracero program helped out during World War II. Will we need something similar moving forward? I did a little Googling on the Bracero program. Are you familiar with that, Sam?
Yeah, so the Bracero program was essentially an effort to bring in farm labor during World War II because so many of the young men who would ordinarily do that work were in Europe and the Pacific, right? So it was an effort to bolster the agricultural sector with foreign farm labor. And then, unfortunately, that led to a big deportation program under Eisenhower, whose name I will not say on the air, but you can Google that. Suffice it to say, there's no simple answer on immigration for the simple reason that America isn't a labor market. America has a labor market, right? And so the needs of the labor market are not always the preeminent needs of the country. So I would never suggest that you have to have a particular position on immigration just because of labor demand. But from a mathematical perspective, we do have to be honest about the math. And the math tells us that without foreign immigration, the labor force is stagnant and will shrink over time, right? So, you get to draw your own conclusions from that. My goal is to make sure that everybody has a clear understanding of what the math and the census tells us, right? And without foreign immigration, there is no labor force growth in the country right now.
Sam, we've got a couple questions about how does the U.S. population growth compare to the growth worldwide? Can you share, do other countries have the same issue?
Most what we would call advanced economies have a similar demographic problem. Europe is pretty much 10 years ahead of us on this problem. Europe is quite old because Europe has the same demographic structure as us, but they didn't have a big millennial generation. So Europe essentially skipped the millennials and went straight to an undersized Gen Z. And so labor force in most European countries is a big problem. Japan and South Korea are famously aging very fast because they have very small families. And even China has a notorious population control policy that we don't need to go into the particulars of, but that has the Chinese population set to essentially shrink by half by the end of the century. And you might think that's crazy, but There's 1.3 billion Chinese right now, and the UN forecast is there will be 600 million at the end of the century. And that's pretty simple math because one child is half of two. So their population halves as a result of that policy, and that's what it looks like in the long run, right? The only part of the world that has a rapidly growing population still is Africa. Even Latin American countries are kind of starting to stabilize, taper out. So for example, in Mexico, the birth rate is almost exactly 2.1, right? So Mexico isn't shrinking, but it's not growing. It's essentially reached its flat point. And so this is a global problem, and that may have implications for immigration as a fix, because if your population's shrinking, you become very jealous of your human capital. You don't want it to leave to other countries, right? Because immigration isn't, there's a push-pull dynamic. So this is a universal problem, really, with the exception of Africa.
Thanks, Sam. I wrote down your terminology of warm Homo sapiens because I like that a lot. We've got time maybe for one more question. I think we've got 3 minutes until 1 o'clock. So I'm going to take Greg Swink's question. I apologize to those of you who have asked questions that we haven't got to. Can the trend of older workers continuing to work later in life, either part-time or full-time, move the economic needle?
Working later in life helps to slow the decline of labor force. So it acts as a brake, but it doesn't alter the trajectory altogether. So you're moving in the same direction, just potentially slower. And this is why you hear all these discussions about the actuarial viability of Social Security, for example, right? And I'm obviously not going to go into that. People will be discussing that ceaselessly for years to come, but that's obviously one of the main ways that you can at least try to put a brake on this process is by raising the retirement age, having people work later into life.
Awesome. Thank you for that explanation, Sam. And thank you so much for being with us here today. I think I can speak on behalf of all of the attendees that this is fascinating and deeply concerning and anxiety evoking kind of data. But it's important for us as HR professionals to understand the implications and why these things are happening. So thank you for the education. Please join me in the chat in thanking Sam for his time today, and I will turn things back over to Stephanie Cecil to close us out today.
Thank you, Stephanie Parker. Great names, right? Thank you, Sam. That was amazing information. I am a data geek, so I love all of the graphs and numbers as long as I'm not the one that has to come up with them. I do appreciate how you presented the information, and it's definitely sobering to look at it in that light. Thank you, Stephanie, for moderating the chat and the Q&A. And I also want to say thank you to Nick and his team at IBL Events for hosting our webinar for us today, ensuring that everything ran smoothly. We would not have been able to do this successfully without them. Lastly, I want to thank all of you who signed up for the webinar. We will make copies of the presentation, the slide deck available, and we've also recorded this, and so everyone that signed up will get a copy of the recording. Before you go, we have one more poll question that we want everybody to answer, so you should see that pop up on your screen. Thank you for attending, and the next slide will have our SHRM credit information. So this has been approved for 1 hour for SHRM recertification for the CP or SCP. Thank you again for attending. Thank you for your participation. The questions were wonderful. And I hope you have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you when we have another webinar in the future. Thank you.